He is a legitimate Aikido black belt.
In the flashy world of action cinema, few rivalries have sparked as much intrigue and controversy as that between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal. On the surface, both men dominated the late 80s and early 90s with their signature martial arts styles and tough guy personas. But behind the scenes, tension brewed for years, fueled by egos, bold claims, and one unforgettable almost fight at a Hollywood party.
Clint Eastwood doesn't have to be an accurate shot. He just needs to look like it. So I don't hold that against Steven Seagal.
While Seagal portrayed himself as a mysterious Aikido master with ties to covert operations, Van Damme remained more grounded, an accomplished kickboxer with real tournament experience. Over time, Seagal's stories began to feel more like myths, while Van Damme quietly let his actions speak louder than words. Yet when pushed, Van Damme didn't hold back. In one interview, he leaned forward and said plainly, "It's time for the truth." This is the story of that truth.
I would love to see a Steven Seagal in part 3. He should lose some weight.
And why so many believe Steven Seagal is, in fact, a fraud. Rise of two action heroes. Before the feud ever made headlines, Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal were riding the same explosive wave of Hollywood martial arts stardom. Both emerged during the golden age of action films, but their backgrounds and approaches to fame couldn't have been more different. Steven Seagal entered the scene in 1988 with Above the Law, marketed not only as an action star but also as a legitimate martial artist and law enforcement insider. His claim to fame was Aikido, a Japanese martial art focused on redirection and joint locks. He was mysterious, stoic, and always seemed to carry an air of quiet danger. Stories floated around about how he was the first Westerner to operate an Aikido dojo in Japan and that he had connections to the CIA. Whether those stories were true didn't seem to matter. People believed them. Jean-Claude Van Damme, on the other hand, was the opposite of Seagal's brooding style. Born in Belgium, Van Damme came up through actual competitive martial arts, earning titles in full-contact karate and kickboxing. He was flamboyant, flexible, and incredibly fast. His breakout role in Bloodsport, 1988, showcased not just his athleticism but his charisma. The movie launched him into superstardom, and his follow-ups, Kickboxer, Cyborg, Lionheart, sealed the deal. Fans were wowed by his splits, spinning heel kicks, and camera-ready charm. While Seagal moved like a bulldozer, slow, strong, deliberate, Van Damme was the showman, all speed, grace, and power. It wasn't long before Hollywood and the media began drawing comparisons between the two, casting them as polar opposites in the same arena. But there was a problem. Seagal didn't respect Van Damme. Behind closed doors, and sometimes even publicly, Seagal would scoff at Van Damme's flashy style. He reportedly referred to him as "that ballet dancer," mocking Van Damme's early ballet training and high kicks. Van Damme, at first, avoided confrontation, but he remembered. As both men climbed the ladder of fame, tensions simmered beneath the surface. What should have been healthy competition began shifting toward personal disdain, at least from Seagal's side. He often talked down about other martial arts stars, Chuck Norris, Bruce Lee's students, even legendary stuntmen. Van Damme was just the most consistent target. What neither of them realized at the time was that this rivalry wouldn't just define their careers. It would eventually expose much more than hurt egos. It would pull back the curtain on who was the real deal and who was just good at pretending. Where the beef began. Rivalries in Hollywood aren't new, but the one between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal was something else entirely. It wasn't a studio-manufactured feud or a media stunt. It was personal. And it started with ego, disrespect, and one man's relentless habit of putting others down to elevate himself.
Do I think he's a martial artist? No. Do I think Jean-Claude's a tough guy or martial artist? No.
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, both men were at the height of their careers. They were the faces of martial arts in Western cinema. But instead of mutual respect between two giants of the genre, Steven Seagal made it clear. He didn't like Van Damme, and he didn't think he was the real deal. In early interviews, Seagal didn't hold back. He mocked Van Damme's fighting credentials, insinuating that his flashy kicks and ballet background were all for show. In one infamous soundbite, Seagal reportedly said, "Van Damme couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag." That single sentence would echo for years. To fans, it was confusing. Van Damme had actually fought. He'd won real competitions in Europe and trained in multiple disciplines. Seagal, on the other hand, had no recorded tournament history. His martial arts background was rooted in Aikido, an art often criticized for its lack of practicality in real combat. Still, he carried himself with supreme confidence. Seagal didn't just act like he was a master. He told everyone he was, and expected the world to believe it. But his attacks on Van Damme weren't isolated. Seagal had a pattern of belittling other martial artists in the industry. He took shots at Chuck Norris, questioning his combat skills. Even though Norris was a world karate champion, he dismissed Bruce Lee's students, once claiming that Bruce Lee was an actor, not a fighter, a statement that earned him massive backlash. He even drew ire from Judo Gene LaBelle, a respected martial artist and Hollywood stuntman, who reportedly choked Seagal out on a film set after Seagal claimed no one could. In contrast, Jean-Claude Van Damme rarely spoke badly about anyone. He wasn't one to chase controversy or stir drama, but he was listening, and he didn't forget. Over time, the disrespect from Seagal began to add up. While Van Damme continued building his career, starring in hits like Universal Soldier, Time Cop, and Hard Target, the whispers behind the scenes started getting louder. Seagal was talking trash, and Van Damme was preparing to answer. Industry insiders noted that Van Damme's team began distancing him from Seagal. When asked about Seagal in interviews, Van Damme gave brief, tight-lipped responses. But there was always a glimmer in his eye, a restrained expression, as if he was biting his tongue. The real turning point came when stories started circulating in Hollywood circles that Seagal wasn't just mocking Van Damme privately. He was boasting about being able to beat him in a real fight. More than once, Seagal reportedly said that Van Damme was all flash and no substance. At first, Van Damme didn't take the bait, but after hearing these jabs repeated over the years, the Belgian action star was done staying quiet. In one interview, Van Damme said calmly, "He's got a mouth, he likes to talk. I prefer to show what I can do." When pressed further about Seagal's comments, he added with a smirk, "It's funny. I don't remember seeing him in any tournaments." These subtle digs were Van Damme's way of drawing a line. He didn't scream, he didn't get aggressive, but he let the world know. He was not afraid of Seagal, and if Seagal wanted to go there, Van Damme was ready. What made the feud even more interesting was the media's growing fascination with it. Action movie fans wanted to know, who would win in a real fight, Van Damme or Seagal? Commentators and martial arts experts often weighed in. The majority leaned toward Van Damme. Why? Because Van Damme had a proven track record of fighting. He wasn't just choreographing moves for the camera, he had stepped into the ring. Meanwhile, Seagal's credentials seemed harder to verify. The more he claimed, the more questions people had. Who had he really trained? Where were the records? Why was there no documented evidence of his supposed real-life fights? But still, Seagal didn't stop talking. His arrogance knew no bounds. That arrogance eventually would lead to the most legendary near-fight in Hollywood history. Something so memorable it's still talked about today. The groundwork had been laid. Years of insults, mockery, and provocation had pushed Van Damme to the edge. He had taken the high road for years, staying professional, while Seagal took cheap shots. But every man has a breaking point. And when the opportunity finally came for Van Damme to confront Seagal face to face, without cameras, without scripts, without PR people in the way, he took it. He offered him the fight Seagal claimed to want. And Seagal? He walked away. But that part of the story, perhaps the most infamous chapter of their feud, is coming next. The infamous Stalin party incident. It was the moment every martial arts fan secretly wished had been caught on camera. The place? Sylvester Stallone's mansion in Miami. The occasion? A lavish 1990s party filled with action stars, Hollywood elites, and enough testosterone to power a Michael Bay film. But the real fireworks didn't come from the guest list or the open bar. They came from a long brewing confrontation between Steven Seagal and Jean-Claude Van Damme. A showdown that almost happened but never did. According to multiple eyewitnesses, including Stallone himself, the night unfolded like a movie script. Steven Seagal was making his usual rounds, telling stories, boasting about his martial arts prowess, and, as had become his habit, talking down other stars. Once again, Van Damme's name came up. Once again, Seagal claimed that he could easily take him. Only this time, Van Damme heard it for himself. Van Damme had been enjoying the party quietly, But once word got to him that Seagal was running his mouth yet again, something changed. He'd had enough. This wasn't the set of an action movie. There were no stunt doubles, no slow-motion sequences, and no directors yelling "cut." It was just two men in the same room, with nowhere to hide. According to Stallone's retelling of the incident in later interviews, Van Damme calmly walked up to Seagal and said something along the lines of, "I heard what you said, let's go outside." There was no yelling, no chaos, just a direct challenge. Seagal, who had always presented himself as a no-nonsense martial arts expert, didn't move. Instead of standing up or accepting the challenge, he reportedly brushed it off with a smirk and tried to laugh it away. Van Damme pushed again, this time firmer. "You talk a lot, let's see what you can do." Witnesses said the room fell quiet. Everyone was waiting for the two titans to finally clash. But Seagal backed down. Not only did he refuse to step outside, he left the party entirely. Van Damme, possibly fueled by adrenaline and years of pent-up irritation, followed him. When he found Seagal again later that night, Van Damme repeated the challenge. Again, Seagal declined. Stallone later described it as one of the most surreal moments he'd ever witnessed. Van Damme was tired of Seagal trash-talking him, so he challenged him, Stallone said. Seagal wanted none of it. He fled. That single night did more damage to Seagal's reputation than any film critic ever could. In an instant, the tough guy aura he had so carefully cultivated began to crumble. He had been publicly challenged, without a camera rolling, without a script, and had walked away. Twice. For Van Damme, the incident was vindication. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He had stood up to the man who'd been undermining him for years, and while the fight never physically happened, the message couldn't have been clearer. Seagal talked the talk, but wouldn't walk the walk. The fallout from the Stallone party incident rippled through Hollywood. While neither actor addressed it in detail publicly at the time, the story leaked out and took on a life of its own. Martial arts fans debated who would have won had the fight actually happened. Most gave the edge to Van Damme, not just for his competitive experience, but for actually showing up. Meanwhile, Seagal's mystique started to fade. Rumors spread. Was his Aikido really as effective as he claimed? Was his backstory just smoke and mirrors? If he was so confident, why didn't he take the challenge? That night at Stallone's house remains a defining moment, not just in their feud, but in the public perception of both men. Van Damme came off as real, calm, confident, and willing to back up his reputation. Seagal, for all his stories and swagger, looked like a man who had something to hide. And as Van Damme would later hint in another interview, reflecting on that night with a knowing smile, it's time for the truth. Van Damme calling Seagal out. In the years following the infamous Stallone party incident, Jean-Claude Van Damme never made it his mission to destroy Steven Seagal publicly, but he didn't need to. His demeanor, tone, and carefully chosen words in interviews said everything without saying too much. As the industry and fans alike began questioning Seagal's authenticity, Van Damme increasingly allowed himself to voice what many had been thinking all along. Seagal was more myth than man. Whenever the topic of Seagal came up, Van Damme handled it with an almost surgical level of control. He didn't launch into insults or heated rants. Instead, he kept his tone measured, almost amused. He spoke of respect for martial arts, but subtly pointed out how some actors exaggerated their abilities. He'd mention how real fighters don't need to constantly assert dominance, especially not by speaking negatively about others in their field. Observers noted that while Van Damme never named names in these comments, the context was always unmistakable. He would describe how some martial artists in the industry had never actually competed, yet built careers around fabricated legends. There was a quiet jab in those statements, a pointed critique of someone who had built his brand on stories that couldn't be verified. More than once, Van Damme alluded to the fact that he had earned his place through discipline and real training, not through backroom bragging or inflated claims. And when he spoke about the Stallone party years later, he didn't need to boast. The details were already well known. What stood out was Van Damme's tone, confident, calm, and grounded in reality. He wasn't telling a story for attention. He was recalling an event that confirmed what he, and many others, had long suspected, that Seagal was afraid to be tested in real time. Unlike Seagal, Van Damme had always put his body on the line. From the early days of European karate circuits to the rigorous choreography of his action films, his training and endurance were on display. His audience had seen him move. They had watched him execute kicks with precision and grace. There was no mystery surrounding his skill set. It was visible in every frame. By contrast, Seagal's skills seemed shrouded in ambiguity. Few could point to concrete demonstrations of his ability outside of staged environments. His Aikido, while respectable as a traditional martial art, lacked the practical impact of Van Damme's kickboxing or full-contact experience. And while Seagal frequently boasted of his past exploits, training special forces, running dojos in Japan, even claiming spiritual connections, Van Damme made it clear that he had little patience for such theatrics. In one interview, Van Damme discussed the nature of martial arts in cinema and explained how film should be about inspiring people, not feeding egos. He then shifted the conversation, almost casually, to a criticism of those who take themselves too seriously and try to intimidate others with stories instead of substance. Without naming Seagal, he made it clear who he was referencing: the man who wouldn't step outside at Stallone's party. The man who had mocked him for years without ever proving his own worth. Industry insiders picked up on it instantly. Van Damme's commentary struck a chord because it wasn't petty, it was measured and dignified. He wasn't trying to tear Seagal down, he was simply holding up a mirror. And what that mirror reflected was uncomfortable for Seagal's camp. A legacy built more on image than on actual combat ability. The contrast between the two men only grew more pronounced as their careers aged. Van Damme, though weathered by fame and personal struggles, remained respected within both the martial arts and film communities. He evolved, poked fun at himself in interviews, and remained open about his flaws. Seagal, on the other hand, grew increasingly isolated. His claims became even more extravagant, ranging from his alleged connections to foreign governments to being a spiritual warrior. Meanwhile, criticism mounted. Former stuntmen, co-stars, and martial artists began to openly question his credentials. Van Damme, always the tactician, simply stepped back and let others do the talking. In the end, his quiet takedown of Seagal wasn't built on bravado. It was built on discipline, results, and a willingness to be tested. By carrying himself with humility and precision, Van Damme exposed what many had always suspected: that real strength doesn't need to announce itself, and that sometimes the loudest in the room has the least to prove. The martial arts credentials question: real fighter versus movie faker. At the heart of the Van Damme versus Seagal feud lies a much bigger conversation, one that's echoed across gyms, dojos, and Hollywood sets for decades. Who's the real martial artist, and who's just acting like one? In this debate, Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal have come to represent two very different sides of the same coin. From the start, Van Damme's credentials were easier to verify. Born in Belgium, he trained in Shotokan karate from an early age, eventually earning a black belt. He also studied kickboxing and full-contact karate, disciplines that require not only technique, but conditioning, resilience, and actual competition experience. His record as an amateur fighter was real, documented bouts in Europe, with wins that could be confirmed. He didn't just train for the screen. He stepped into rings and earned victories. Long before Bloodsport made him an international star, he was fighting, stretching, sweating, and developing a skill set that translated naturally to the screen. Meanwhile, Seagal's martial arts legacy was more mysterious and much more difficult to fact-check. His background in Aikido is widely known. He claimed to be the first Westerner to operate an Aikido dojo in Japan, a claim repeated so often it became part of his brand. However, many martial artists, especially those familiar with Japanese systems, began questioning the details. There was no doubt that Seagal trained in Aikido, but the extent of his mastery and the veracity of his accomplishments in Japan remained murky. Compounding this was Aikido's reputation itself. Unlike karate, kickboxing, or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Aikido is a non-competitive martial art. It focuses on using an opponent's momentum against them, with techniques built around redirection, wrist locks, and throws. It's elegant and beautiful when executed correctly, but often criticized for being impractical in real combat. Critics argue that it works well in theory or against compliant training partners, but doesn't hold up in real-world scenarios. That critique became central in the Van Damme-Seagal divide. While Van Damme was known for physically demanding roles and live demonstrations of his capabilities, Seagal became known for telling stories about his abilities rather than showing them. He claimed to have trained CIA operatives, fought real-life criminals, and even killed a man in self-defense overseas. But as years passed, evidence of these events never surfaced. His stories grew more elaborate, but not more credible. And as Van Damme would continue to speak in carefully measured tones about martial arts, truth, and respect, it became clear who the world believed. The man who didn't need to shout, didn't need to boast, and didn't need to back down when challenged. Legacy and public opinion. Who came out on top? Over time, the feud between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal became more than just a clash of egos. It became a symbol of authenticity versus illusion. While both men were icons of the action genre, the paths they took and the reputations they built couldn't have been more different. Van Damme, despite personal ups and downs, remained respected in both the martial arts world and Hollywood. His skills were proven, his performances dynamic, and his humility evident in later years. He was human, flawed but real. Seagal, by contrast, watched his reputation steadily erode. As more stories emerged questioning his past, his unwillingness to fight Van Damme, and his ever-growing list of questionable claims, fans began to see through the facade. For many, Seagal became less of a martial artist and more of a caricature. In the end, Van Damme didn't need to throw a punch to win the fight. His calm demeanor, authentic background, and quiet confidence spoke louder than any boast could. What do you value more in your heroes, real skill and humility, or image and bravado? And can a person still be respected if the truth behind their legend doesn't hold up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.